Your family,
well, he
totally floored where everybody is. Talking about the fact
had the amount of cannabis use and actually leading to college.
I had thought something that Tim King sort of made up, but apparently they discussed these.
All right, good evening, everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started. My colleague Nikichi Taifa and I would like to welcome you to Open Society Foundations. This is the DC office. I'm a policy analyst here at Open Society. I work on school to prison pipeline issues and criminal justice and racial reform issues. Nikichi unfortunately can't be here today. She's feeling ill, so she wanted me to give my warm regards to many of her colleagues and peers and closest friends out in the audience today. I know she wished she could be here, and she's probably somewhere lurking on the phone. Knowing Nikichi, but she wanted me to relate to you that our Justice Roundtables, Crack the Disparity Coalition, brought Willie Aikens to DC on 2 occasions. First to testify after the release before the House Judiciary Committee, which helped spearhead reform on draconian crack cocaine sentencing laws. His very eloquent testimony can be found on page 241 of Greg Jordan's book. The second was at the coalition celebration in this very room and on the rooftop on the 12th floor on the passage and signing of the Fair Sentencing Act, where he received an award, along with Kimber Smith, Dorothy Gaines, Lawrence Garrison, and Rod Piggy, all of whose lives had been turned upside down by the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which was passed in direct response to the death of Lynn Bias. So I'm looking forward to the conversation and discussion and some of the remarks from our panelists today. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline Fredrickson, who is the Executive Director of the American Constitution Society for Law and Justice, who will give brief remarks and introduce today's moderator. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to also thank the Open Society, Nikichi, who we're all sad can't be here, and Chris for that great introduction. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the president of the American Constitution Society, and I want to welcome you to today's event, Our Losing Game, Sports and the War on Drugs. For those who are not familiar with ACS, we're a national network of lawyers, law professors, law students, policymakers, and judges who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. And we work for positive change by shaping debates on vitally important legal and constitutional issues through the development and promotion of high-impact ideas, by holding programs like this today, by publishing materials, and by engaging our members in the issues of the day. If you support these efforts and you are not yet a formal part of our network, I encourage you to become a member of the American Constitution Society today. We need your help to make a difference. So tonight's conversation is a continuation of ACS programming generated out of our criminal justice issue group. This issue group examines the administration of our criminal laws and the challenges that such administration poses to our nation's fundamental belief in liberty and equality. It is in this forum that ACS considers drug and sentencing policy, among other issues. And we recently published an issue brief by the Sentencing Project's Kara Gotch, After the War on Drugs, the Fair Sentencing Act and the Unfinished Drug Policy Reform Agenda. We also convened a program called The Relevancy and Reach of the U.S. Sentencing Commission with the ACLU's Washington Legislative Office. This evening, we will continue these discussions around the war on drugs, a war that was declared a little over 40 years ago. It is a war that has led to the highest incarceration rate in the world for the United States, with over 2 million people in prison. It is a war that has cost the country $1 trillion, and it is a war that has affected many, many people, including some very celebrated professional athletes, as we will explore tonight. To facilitate this wonderful conversation, we are pleased to have with us Darryl Fears. Darryl is the national staff reporter for the Washington Post, where he has worked for more than a decade. He has covered race, immigration, and prison reform for the Post, and now focuses primarily on the environment. Previously, Darryl has been a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the LA Times. and he graduated here locally from Howard University. So please join me in welcoming Darryl Fears and our distinguished authors.
Thank you. I wanted to thank the Open Society Institute for having us here today, also the American Constitution Society. And I guess I'll open with some remarks and then I'll introduce our two authors. Dave, I'm not sure.
Ungrady, but it's been butchered many times.
Yes, Dave Ungrady and Gregory Jordan. See, 5 years ago, just before Thanksgiving, I wrote a story about a thaw in one of the coldest eras in the war on drugs. The federal panel that recommends sentences for federal crimes had decided after 20 years that the enormous disparity between sentences for possessing and distributing crack cocaine and powder cocaine was unfair. 80% of the defendants in such cases were black, 6% were white. After reporting that story, I got a call about a troubling case of a former Major League Baseball player named Willie Mays Aikens. The reporting of that story led me to the origin of tough crack sentencing and the death of Len Bias from a cocaine overdose in 1986, a story that I, like everyone else, knew well. What many people did not know is that Congress mistakenly thought crack cocaine played a role in Bias's death, and that the Congressional Black Caucus joined with other lawmakers in the clamor to end the scourge on black communities with long jail terms for offenders. Men and women caught selling, possessing 50 grams of crack receive a sentence equal to 500 grams of powder, a 100-to-1 ratio. In Aikens' case, his lawyers argued that he was a cocaine addict who was encouraged by a police informant to cook powder cocaine he purchased into crack for the purpose of getting a stronger sentence for a high-profile case. As I wrote this story, I thought, this will make a great book. So, we have, do I push this? So we have Dave Ungrady here, who wrote about Len Bias, and we have Greg Jordan, who wrote about Willie Mays Aikens. And so since we have that narrative arc from Bias to Aikens, we want to start with Dave and the Len Bias story.
To recap as briefly as I can about who Len Bias was. Everybody here know who Len Bias was in this story? Does everybody realize that a lot of people considered him to be as good, if not better, than Michael Jordan? Yeah. Michael Jordan's won 6 NBA titles. Len Bias is about to play for the Celtics. In June, on June 17th of 1986, he was drafted #2 by the Boston Celtics. He was a 2-time ACC Player of the Year at Maryland, the only time it's happened at Maryland. He was a year behind Michael Jordan. If you're a basketball fan, and if you want to see some great highlights, go to YouTube and just search for 1984 Cole Fieldhouse Jordan versus Bias. There's a 10-minute video clip of those two going at it pretty hard. It's great to watch if you're a basketball fan. But that'll give you an idea of how good Len Bias was compared to Michael Jordan. It was a game in 1984 in Cole Fieldhouse when Len was a sophomore and Michael was a junior, Jordan's last year. Bias outscored him 27-21. Carolina won, but Bias had the better of Jordan that night, and in most of the games they played against each other, Bias was equal, if not better than Jordan. 2 days after the Boston Celtics made him the #2 pick in the NBA draft, he comes back to the College Park campus and is partying in his dorm room. Ironically, he was still taking summer school classes officially, but I don't know how much he was going to class at that time. He was partying with 2 teammates and a friend, and he snorted a very large amount of cocaine called Fish Scale, which is 98% pure. And Len Bias had the attitude where he could handle anything. He liked to consider himself as a horse. He could handle any physical challenge, any mental challenge, and cocaine was just another thing he thought he could conquer. He made a very bad decision to snort way too much. He had a seizure and died 2 hours later. And his death affected many, many, many people and things. The University of Maryland Athletic Department was devastated for at least 10 years. I was an athlete there in the late 1970s. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. I knew a lot of people who were affected by his death in the athletics department. Devastated that department for 10 years. It still lingers today, more than 25 years later in some regards. The Celtics were devastated. They won the NBA title in 1986. They had won 3 NBA titles that decade. They were about to start another string of NBA supremacy. They were the best team of the 50s and the 60s in the NBA. They won 8 NBA titles in a row. They were on the verge of coming close, if not repeating what they did in the 50s and 60s. They didn't win another NBA championship for more than 20 years. 2008 was the next time they won. Federal drug legislation, as Darryl referred to, the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed directly because of Len's death. Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House at that time for the Democrats. The Democrats were trying to gain a political, or maintain their political edge over the Republicans in the House and the Senate. They had bigger numbers in both chambers. They were trying to maintain that, and they did. They used that incident to put into legislation the act, which, as Del referred to, ended up putting a lot of young black men into prison. In the 6 years since the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed, prison population related to drug charges rose 300%. And it just escalated more after that as well. So Len's death had some practical effects. It had some personal effects. The family was devastated. His teammates had to endure many personal challenges living with being his friend and teammate. It affected their career paths. So on a personal and practical level, it had a very vast legacy.
Dave, in your research, did you find out why lawmakers were under the mistaken belief that Bias died from a crack cocaine overdose as opposed to powder cocaine?
Part of the problem was there wasn't enough research done in committee before it reached the House and the Senate. There was one hearing held in committee before it was passed in the House and then in the Senate. And apparently the person that they relied on as the source of information to support the legislation, his background was even lacked credibility. But there was, all they were thinking about at that time after Len died, it was a national story for 3 months, maybe even 6 months. And there was a hysteria created. Anyone who was a young adult, I was a young adult at that time, if you remember, cocaine was everywhere. It was considered a recreational drug. His death changed that perception. Dr. Robert DuPont was the director of the National Institute for Drug Abuse in the 70s, and he has been an advocate for drug rehabilitation and helping people with drug and alcohol abuse. He said Len Bias's death, along with the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous, were the 2 most important things of incidents in the 20th century to alter the perception of drug and alcohol abuse. So there was a hysteria, there wasn't enough proper research done, and Tip O'Neill and the Democrats saw an advantage in the political advantage just getting this through Congress. They took advantage of the public outcry, and the public wanted something done.
So Bias's death starts this story, right? It starts this specific front in a war on drugs, a war against crack cocaine. And in 1986, when Bias died, I was in Detroit, Michigan. I was actually a young police reporter and writing about the crack cocaine and the impact that it was having on that city. That city at the time was the murder capital. And people were wondering, well, what would we do about this? And I think that Congress's overreaction was a part of that. But you kick off this story where you have arrests and sentences for crack cocaine possession, and very harsh. And it takes us to Willie Mays Aikens, right? And Greg is going to explain Willie Mays Aikens' story and how Willie Mays Aikens is basically a metaphor for tens of thousands of people who were arrested and sentenced under these guidelines.
We'll back up a few years from '86 to 1980, midwinter 1980 in Seneca, South Carolina, when Willie was home during the off season with his friends one night, and they were getting high, and someone said, "Willie, Ronald Reagan was on television," and one of Willie's friends said to him, "You remind me a lot of Ronald Reagan." And Willie said, "What are you talking?" He said, "You are Ronald Reagan. You're outgoing, you're generous, you're funny, you have a great presence, people fall in love with you. Let's call him and ask him to come get high with us." And they picked up the phone and they called the White House. And I think that sort of event typifies the kind of party atmosphere that Dave's referring to, the 80s. And it was great fun for a lot of people. More than anything, I think it provided a sense of community that I think a lot of athletes crave. They can sit around together with people who are compatriots for a night and be themselves and relax. You fast forward to Darryl, your point about then the government gets involved, they realize we have a problem, and the draconian reaction, which was part of this whole three-strike, you're out, I think, movement, the belief that humans can't change, that an individual human being can't improve, that a behavior can't be corrected, even though we call it the correctional system, and the overreaction to what is really the same substance, crack. And it's science has proven it's the same thing. Yet there was race involved, there was urban policy involved, and it wasn't treated as the same thing, as we all know. It was treated as a very, very different thing. Willie Mays Aikens is probably, perhaps next to my father, the most gentle human being I've ever met. He would not hurt anything, an animal, a human being, and yet he was treated with such viciousness, 20 years and 8 months, and set up to boot, set up. He was not a crack dealer. He was convinced to be one by a pretty lady with whom he was vulnerable because she was beguiling, and the rest of the story was he went to prison for a long, long time, experienced a lot of things that he allowed me to live through with him. But the effects of, as Darryl said, of these laws, this is one individual story. There are thousands of them, and Willie's now trying to bring a lot of people out like he got out with the reform that's ongoing, but heartbreaking.
So Willie was, I guess, he was eligible for that 101 ratio to be sentenced under that. How did prosecutors kind of supersize his sentence? Yeah. How did that happen? And this is sort of a byproduct of these laws.
In three ways. One was to one of the 5 setup transactions between a policewoman and Willie was orchestrated to occur near a school, which I'm not sure the exact amount that increases his sentence, but that was one. The other was a gun, was nowhere on his premises, nowhere a shotgun. It did not make the arrest report, but by the time the trial came around, it was back in the report. So he was set up in that way too. Of course, the biggest is Coke versus, he always had Coke, but she wanted rock, she wanted it. And when he didn't have it, he'd go get it, and they'd have to bake it, and it was always a certain weight, certain grams. And so every one of those steps, every one of those misdeeds that were coerced got him another year to 3 years each time.
How much time did Willie wind up spending?
14. He got 20 years and 8 months. He ended up doing 14. And he was prepared to die in jail. There's a scene where Pat Gillick, who's now in the Baseball Hall of Fame, visits him. And he says, "Pat, I'm going to die here." And I'm at peace with that. But he rehabilitated himself. There was virtually no, even the social services program in prison were not effective in helping him shed his drug habit and become a flourishing human being, which he is now. I want to emphasize that. He's a hitting coach for the Kansas City Royals. He has a new baby daughter with the woman with whom he had a daughter who's now 22 years old, graduating from Grinnell. His daughter is this month. It's an extraordinary story of redemption that proves, and every one of those thousands of stories of disaster, of catastrophe, of discrimination could, I'm sure, at least half of them could result in redemption this way.
So Willie was rescued from his sentence so to speak, by sentencing reductions that were a process that began when I was writing about this in 2007. And I wanted to talk about that period a little bit because these reductions that were considered by the U.S. Sentencing Commission didn't just start by the goodwill of the commission. And if the two authors, Dave, if you can start, talk about the motivation behind this action. There were groups, correct?
Yes. By the mid-1990s, people started becoming more aware of these sentences that were being given to these criminals, and how skewed they were against them, and how really unfair they were. That combined with the drug problem in the inner city, drug problems in the cities, started to wane a little bit. It wasn't as bad as the 80s. Cocaine, partially due to Len's death, there was more awareness of it, so there wasn't as much concern of how, at least in society, the problem with drugs were creating in the urban environments as they were in the 80s. Families Against Mandatory Minimums. Eric, was your group started at that point as well?
Yeah, we started in 1989, and we started FAM in 1990.
Right. And your group again is called?
Criminal Justice Policy Foundation.
Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. Eric was very instrumental in turning the tide against these sentences. Eric was actually, and he was very helpful with my book, he was part of the legislative process to pass the bill. And he talks in the book about how that has bothered him through the years. He's now an advocate against those kind of sentences and sort of fixing, if I'm misstating, let me know, but fixing that situation. So more groups started to become aware of the victims. We can call them victims of these sentences. I read about Kemba Smith in the book, who is a national figure in this fight. Her sentence was commuted by, actually, was it commuted? What's her sentence?
Clinton commuted in 2000, December 2000, before
right.
Christmas.
Then there was Derek Curry, who was actually a very good friend of Len Bias's brother Jay, and knew Len. He played, Derek Curry played high school basketball with Jay Bias, who, by the way, was considered as good a player at a high school as Len Bias. Derek Curry was sort of he was caught passing drugs, and he never used it, and his sentence was 15 or 20 years. His sentence was commuted in 2000 by President Clinton. There were more of these situations coming about, and it created more awareness of how unfair these sentences were. And then the Fair Sentencing Commission started to, or the Sentencing Commission started to review this more, and it just built more and more. Eric, if I'm missing something, please feel free to add anything that you think might add to that.
The only thing I would add is that the Nikichi Taifa from the Open Society Foundation in 2005, looking at 2006 being the 20th anniversary, convened a working group under the auspices of the Justice Roundtable.
Okay.
And it was that group that sort of said, we're going to make a campaign, a sustained effort to end these sentences. And with the ACLU, the Sentencing Project, the Drug Policy Alliance, those were sort of the key institutional players in sort of driving this work.
Thank you.
And so what these groups point out is that, as these harsh sentences are handed down over the years, I think I wrote a story in 2008 that said that 7.2 million Americans played some role in the criminal justice system. And so they were either in prison, or they were on parole, or they were on probation. 7.2 million people is just a huge number of people. Caroline said in her opening remarks that 2 million people were in prison, and that's more than China. That's more than any nation in the world. And so this is what Willie Mays Aikens was caught up in. I think you wanted to talk about the sentences and the commutations by Clinton and the choices he made and who got commuted and who didn't.
Yeah, it's an amazing American moment. I mean, Eric, we talked about this last year when I was with you. I think I feel a little more strongly than you do, although we agreed in the end that this is a bipartisan failure. The pardons, you'll recall, the most famous one, the Clinton pardon, was Mark Rich, the financier in Switzerland. Willie was watching TV that day because his agent and a lot of powerful people here, including Margaret Love, had really worked to get him on Clinton's desk. And that pardon, had it occurred, would, I think, have expedited this reform that's still ongoing. It would have just probably ended it right there. It would have been such a significant statement. And, Clinton is more and more beatified by the day. But you'll recall he pardoned his brother and his brother's buddies for coke. Of course, Roger was a good time boy. And coke, I don't want to push it too far, but we know what the racial affiliations of each supposed drug use is. That said, the irony of it is Roger did time in a Fort Worth minimum security prison where Willie served his first sentence for cocaine use. So the connections between the two, beyond personality, because as I think back to Roger Clinton's behavior, he seemed like he and Willie remind me of each other just in their public personas. Very, very good time guys. But Clinton's failure to act, we found out that it was at least on Eric Holder's desk, if not on Clinton's desk. We know for a fact that Ron Shapiro had spoken with Clinton directly. It didn't happen. So the failure, it was across the board. And I think, to pay tribute to you guys, this is a rare example in American policy reform and criminal justice reform where the outside groups really just keep attacking, and have effect, despite both political parties being opposed to it. The Dems were losing their cities, the Republicans were terrified, and that cohered into a hysteria that to this day, Eric is trying to overturn. So.
Well, also, very important people who deserve credit are in the audience. Justin McCurdy from the ACLU, Jasmine Tyler from the Drug Policy Alliance. They were key. Yeah. They did a lot more than I did because they actually did the lobbying.
I say you because I know, the work that was done on Willie's behalf and on a lot of people's behalf outside of the political mainstream was extraordinary. And I think, can you think of a better example of democracy in action having an effect than this? I mean, it's people just bird-dogged it, and change is happening because of it. But had Clinton done it, the mainstream would have endorsed change, and it didn't happen.
We mentioned Kimber Smith twice in this panel, and I think her story is very important. The story of most of the offenders who were in prison as a result of these sentencing guidelines are black males, but black females paid a heavy price for living in homes with men who were possessing and dealing drugs, and in many cases unaware of it. I think that Kimber was aware, but pressure, the government put pressure on the girlfriends, wives, and wives of these subjects in order to get a testimony against them. And in many cases, people refused, of course. And so you had hundreds and thousands of black women in prison for having never possessed or sold crack cocaine. And I wonder if either of you explored this at all or looked into this.
I wrote quite a bit about Kemba in the section of my book about how the nation was impacted by Len's death. Excuse me. Kemba was a college student in Richmond who met a young man who used to hang around the campus. He wasn't a student. She didn't know about his background. She fell in love with him for all the wrong reasons. She was a very impressionable young lady, very attractive, only child. And she fell into his web of deceit and deception and followed him across the country as he dealt drugs. And she claims she never dealt drugs with him over the course of a 3 or 4 year relationship. It wasn't any longer than that, maybe 2 or 3 years. But it got to the point where her family tried to help her. Her parents were very supportive, very successful family in the Richmond area. They couldn't get through to her. She ended up traveling to the West Coast with him, and they lived on the street for a while. And her life was turned completely upside down because of her her affection and her desire to be with a man who was a very charismatic man who was a drug dealer. And she found out later he was also a murderer, and she didn't know that. She was brought up on charges for conspiracy. I may have some of the charges wrong, but conspiracy and possession. May have been another charge, but she, and I forget the exact amount of her sentence, but it was a very long sentence. And they were stunned when they got the verdict. They expected her to walk or get probation or something, but she was sent to jail for many, many years, and she had her first child in jail. Her boyfriend was the father of the child. So her parents and she had to endure that experience of having their first grandchild born in prison. And I write about what they experienced and how they dealt with that situation, which was pretty traumatic for the entire family. Kemba's sentence was commuted as well. And she has also written a book, and I haven't read it yet. I hope to get to it at some point. But Kemba has become an advocate for sentencing reform and travels the country and speaks about it now. She's remarried, she's doing well, but her life was pure hell for almost a decade. And that's, when Darryl refers, and Greg, we all talk about the unfair evolution of these sentencings, she's a prime example of what can happen and what happened.
So I think that we should move on to where are we now. The guidelines were reduced and the sentences were reduced, and people have been released from prison, and they're recovering their lives. But is there any information on, because I stopped covering this story and moved on to the other piece, but do you have any knowledge about if sentences have been further reduced, if are people advocating for further reductions in the sentencing?
The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010, it reduced the mandatory minimum. It kept the sentences, and Eric, if I'm wrong, tell me on any of this. It reduced the disparity between the crack and cocaine penalties from 1 to 100 to 1 to 18. So you have to have a lot more crack cocaine than in the past to get those sentences in. The sentences still remain though, correct, Eric?
The sentences didn't change. The
Right.
trigger quantities changed. So instead of 5 grams, 28 grams triggers 5 years. Instead of 50 grams of crack, 280 grams of crack. That's, about, a little more than a half a pound would trigger, about 10 ounces would trigger the mandatory minimum of 10 years. So these are very, very small changes. It's, remembering that the big dealers are bringing it in by the ton. 1 ton is 1 million grams. So we're talking about changes for the smallest level offenders in this case. So very small offenders are less likely to be punished as harshly as a result of the Fair Sentencing Act.
And as a direct result of that, a lot of those convicted of the crimes are now getting reduced. Are now, not as many are getting the maximum, or the minimum sentences, the large minimum sentences. So, and there was some discussion about how many retroactively would be released from prison as well.
The statute is silent on retroactivity, and this was the issue that was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court last Tuesday as to whether or not it should be interpreted retroactively by judges. Should people who committed the crime beforehand, but who are being sentenced afterward, be the beneficiaries of the Fair Sentencing Act? And that's the issue that's we're awaiting a decision from the Supreme Court.
And the whole ongoing debate still flies in the face of science, right? Which was what was proven at the testimony a year ago in front of Congress. Where was the gentleman, the doctor from the NIH? Who said, look, the chemical composition is the same here, people. We're fighting over cultural associations and prejudices. And, you know, one-to-one is the objective, obviously, and it's the logical conclusion. So the Supreme Court, presidents, what have you, it's scientifically still not a valid discussion.
Okay, so are we ready to open this up for questions from the audience? We wanted to take questions from any media present first. And if there is media present, we'd like you to, when you get the microphone, to state your name and your affiliation, please. Any media? Any media questions? Okay.
We must have done a great job.
Yeah. Okay, so are there any questions out there from anyone in the audience about this?
Good evening. Excuse me. My name is Dave Campanella. I'm with Drug Policy Alliance and Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I followed the Len Bias story. I was born a few years after it, but you know, I've followed it a lot. I'm a big University of Maryland basketball fan. I'm from the area. I guess just the biggest question I've had, and I think that you'll know better than anyone I've ever seen on TV or met or heard that has knowledge on the case is, you know, I don't know a lot about the other players on the team during the time. I didn't follow the team too much back then, obviously, but what would have been the outcome in terms of just the political ramifications, the changes in the drug laws, if the player, Len Bias, if the person who had overdosed from cocaine that night at that party had been white? What do you believe would have been the change? Would there have been as an extensive amount of, you know, would the Anti-Drug Abuse Act have been passed? Would the media have spun it just an entirely different
So
fashion?
Larry Bird at OD, you're saying, right?
Yeah, you know, I didn't want to put any names out. If Larry Bird had OD'd, what would have been the ramifications?
I don't think race would have played any part in the impact if it was someone of as high profile as Len Bias. I don't know how Greg feels about it, but if Larry Bird, or I'm trying to think of a white basketball player that year who was coming out of college. I can't think of any of that prominence. But I don't think it would have made a difference. I think it was because of what was anticipated of him with the set. You had the confluence of his potential as a player, what he showed in college, his reputation as a great player, going to the Celtics, which were the most prominent franchise in NBA history, as a number 2 pick. There was already that awareness created about him and about the situation. If Len Bias had been white, I think the impact would have been the same. I don't think race would have played any issue on it.
You think that it would have been the same? So you believe that the reaction was somewhat emotional?
Oh, completely. Very much so.
By members of Congress?
Yes, very much so. And political. There was a political, and Eric can either with us in this discussion or later can speak much better to the environment there, because he was right in the middle of it. But as I understand it, it was a political reaction to a highly charged emotional situation. Plus, if we can add Tip O'Neill also had a son then who was a drug and alcohol addict, and his son died after Len did, but Tip O'Neill was living that, and that added to his personal motivation to do something about this. And he was a big Celtics fan. All these little emotions going on that added to the impact of the decision, or the progress.
Can we turn it into a debate then?
Yeah, I'd like to hear.
I think
I'm not convinced.
Yeah, I think race is all over it. I mean, I threw out Larry Bird as a joke, but Dave knows this stuff inside out better than I do. But just from my work on the Willie book, he had a hanging judge, and who more or less admitted that race was a factor in his decision. You know, so whether in the overall policy arc, it was not. I think on individual cases, it inevitably was, and that's where it lies.
I was just going to say, I have a follow-up on that, just because I think, but it turned into crack and not powder. So that seems to certainly have a racial dimension.
Well, see, the irony is Len died from cocaine use, not
right. No, that's what I'm saying. So if it had been a white player who died, would they have been the same sentences for both crack and powder at that point, or was it because it was a black player who died and they turned it into crack and there was a so-called crack epidemic going on in the cities that it became sort of part of that story? Seems to me it's hard to disconnect.
I think there's a connection, but I think the reaction would have been the same, whether it was the reaction to what Congress did at that time and the reaction from the public at the time, I think would have been the same. Now, I think race was an issue as it evolved to the disparity between crack and powder, certainly, yes. But the initial reaction to do something by Congress and the reaction by the public that here was a superstar that was destined for greatness, that I don't think race had anything to do with that reaction.
Yeah, so I think the other side of the debate is that because Len Bias was black, crack cocaine became part of the story because crack cocaine was a black story in this nation pretty much. And if a white player had died from a powder cocaine overdose, as Len Bias did, it would have been a powder cocaine overdose. It would have been introduced as a crack cocaine overdose. Not to gang over it, but it seemed that the history of drug abuse in this country and race is fraught with race. And one of the reasons why cocaine was initially prohibited is that certainly Southern legislators didn't want the cocaine in the hands of black people who they thought became these super powerful men once they were high. Any other questions?
Jasmine Tyler from the Drug Policy Alliance. Thank you so much for being here. It's been very interesting to hear from a different perspective how the impact and implementation of these laws really played out. I have a comment and then a question. And one, I just want to update your story about Kemba and say her oldest son, Armani, who was born while she was confined, is now going to be going to UVA in the fall. Right. So that's a really great, full circle for that story. She has her new daughter now too, and so that story is continuing, and her work has continued to be very impactful. So I think it's important to share that, when we talk about Kemba's story. And my question is sort of, you may not be able to answer it, but you brought up a thing that many of us in the advocacy community have been wrestling with, and that's the use of the commutation and pardon power that the president holds, and how some presidents have been better at using it, and even in a broad application compared to other presidents. And unfortunately, the current administration has been very silent, or largely silent, on sort of ramping up the pardon attorney's office and handing out commutations and no pardons, I don't think. So I'm wondering if you all have any advice for us from the outside, or could help us brainstorm right now what you all think could be done to really highlight some of these cases. I mean, you talk about, Willie Mays Aikens' case, who I actually had the opportunity to meet twice and really enjoyed those opportunities when we were able to bring him to DC. And I grew up, here, so I know Len Bias's athletic prowess from being a child, but, we need to promote stories, and sometimes the stories aren't good stories. Sometimes they are good stories. But this is a real area that we have a challenge in, and so any insight that you all have for how we can be more effective in that arena would be helpful.
It's a very bittersweet moment for Willie was election night in '08. For obvious reasons, he was very proud, just as my dad was proud when an Irish Catholic got elected, but Willie couldn't vote, of course, he couldn't vote. So, it was heartbreaking for him. 3 weeks ago, we were talking about the election, and he said, I kind of feel like they let me down. But he said, what the common link is, and I can't extrapolate beyond this, but that, the head of the Justice Department is Eric Holder, and Eric Holder handled Willie's pardon efforts. So I guess you knock on Eric Holder's doors first. But the other thing that's interesting is we also sat with Dean Whipple, who was Willie's judge in Kansas City. And I think an approach that so often works in these situations is the Nixon and China thing. Because Dean Whipple, who he walks in cowboy boots, he has framed Russian military campaign paintings on his wall. He's like he's a cowboy, all right? And he admits, he said, man, if I could talk to Reagan now, I'd say it was all wrong. And he was appointed by Reagan, he was hardcore. Lundgren, too, up on the Hill, seems to be coming around. Maybe that's what you do. You go to the guys who were your staunchest opposition for the longest time.
Well, if I can add, when Greg mentioned Lundgren during the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act, Lundgren admitted in his
Yeah.
chamber testimony that they made a bad decision. So.
I just cited that quote actually in racial profiling testimony that we submitted, but yeah,
Okay.
you're right, you know, and
Yes.
so those voices, it's really important to keep using them.
It was quite poignant when he did that, actually.
Yeah.
It's,
Good stuff.
Yeah.
As far as what the trend will be for commutations, I haven't been following that closely enough. I don't. One reaction may be, I wonder if the impact of these sentences on drug criminals has sort of waned a bit because we've gone through a cycle. Is it? That's just a complete spontaneous reaction right now, based on my research and listening to people here tonight. I don't know. Maybe that's an impact. I don't know.
I think that's an interesting question. I think that some people in the audience are, as a journalist, I'm going to step back from that one. But I think that there are some people in the audience who would be happy to take on that question because I do wonder if it gets to race. You know, you have a president who is trying to stay clear of anything that has any type of racial implication. And so commuting the sentence of black people would just be ammunition against him in the campaign. And I think that that is unfortunate. You have to ask yourself a question. You know, I guess people have to ask them, is it worth it? Any other questions?
Dave, my name is Jessalyn Curry. I'm from ECLU. And first I want to say, was the ESPN 30/30 documentary based on your book?
No, that came out first. I'd like to say it was, but
Okay.
it was. That's one of the reasons I decided to do the book. I'd watched that, and then I realized then I researched to see what books had been written about Len, and nothing since the early 1990s. So I thought it was time to do one.
One of the things that came out, which is crazy, your book now that I know the documentary was based on, but one of the things that I have always had a question about, particularly since I saw the documentary, was how, and being a University of Maryland basketball fan for many years, remembering when Len Bias played for University of Maryland, I'm dating myself, but how complicit was the University of Maryland kind of department, athletic department, not in the overdose itself, but the environment that led to the overdose? And how much, you know, there have been rumors for years that the person that dealt, and this may be not even a rumor, it's not true, that the person that dealt Len Bias the drugs was somebody named Brian Triple. And is that true, and was he just a fall guy in this whole situation?
I'll take the first part. If the athletic department was complicit, I don't think so. Actually, Maryland was one of the first athletic departments to test their athletes for drugs. Now, it wasn't the most sophisticated system. It was random. You could probably grab somebody else's urine and replace it with, switch it out. They had done something. Ironically, interestingly, in 1985, the NCAA had decided to implement a drug testing program, which started in the fall of '86. It wasn't related to Len's death, but Len's death sort of put a microscope on it. I talked to some athletes, even at Maryland, who were part of these testing programs, and they say it was sort of a joke. But it wasn't that. You have preseason testing and then championship. If you make a championship, the testing, and it's random, but it wasn't very random. They didn't test very often. A lot of people put blame on Len's coach, Lefty Drizel, for not doing more, especially his parents. Len's parents felt very bitter toward the university for the coach and the health department not overseeing the activities of the athletes more closely. My view of that is, and I speak partially from being a college athlete, I was there in the late 70s as an athlete, you cannot watch over everybody 24 hours a day. Part of being in college is you learn to be an adult, and whether you make a lot of mistakes, and unfortunately you have to learn by making those mistakes. Len made a very, very bad mistake. It's impossible to ask these coaches and the department to watch over these guys 24 hours a day. Athletes lie. Everybody, college students lie. A coach could have asked him, "What did you do?" If you didn't say, well, he's gonna lie about it. They're very crafty and clever that way. And I think college students in general can be that way. So could they have done more to oversee what the athletes were doing? Maybe. Maybe the testing could have been more strict and more severe. But I find no fault within the department itself. Because, and even today, the athletic departments have really ramped up their scrutiny of athletes with academics and what they're doing off the field, but they're still going to do crazy stuff. It just happens. Oh, I'm sorry, the second part about Tribble, yes. Brian Tribble was a very interesting component of this book. He was the second person I met when I decided to write this book, and we had a very good meeting for about an hour and a half just to get to know each other. Brian Tribble, for those who don't know, was one of 3 people in the room with Len when he died. Brian was the only person charged with a crime in Len's death, conspiracy and possession. He was acquitted of the charges. The trial was about a year after Len died. And in my meeting with Brian, he told me flat out he wanted to get paid, and I didn't pay anybody for the book. It's his mentality that he wants to monetize the situation to this day. He's still trying to do that. Brian's standard response when asked who provided the drugs, and he told me this, and you can go on YouTube and see a trailer for when the documentary came out. There was the premiere of the movie at the theater in Silver Spring. I'm forgetting the name of the theater. And Brian was on stage taking questions, and someone asked him where the drugs came from, and he said the same thing he told me. Not everybody is here to defend themselves, so I'm not going to comment. You take that for whatever it means. I have talked to police officers off the record. I have talked to friends. Actually, it was at an event last weekend who told me, someone who probably would know, that he's certain that Brian Tribble provided the drugs. And this person was in prison with Brian, and he's an ex-convict. He said Brian told him he did. Now that's coming from him. I don't have Brian saying that. Brian was paid $30,000. He told me he was paid $30,000 to be part of the documentary, and he was the star of that documentary. So I guess that one of the sad parts of his legacy is it's not definitive who provided the drugs to Len.
Yes.
If I could add one thing about Brian, he ended up going to jail for 7 or 8 years on drug charges later. So.
Did anyone related to?
No, not related. No.
Yes, I'm wondering whether or not you gentlemen would care to comment on what seems to be a kind of a metamorphosis of this whole drug situation. I'm referring to the current trial on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue of Roger Clemens for perjury to Barry Bonds, charges of perjury for steroids, and you know what you think about how we got to this point where we're talking about steroids and we're not even talking about hard, substances, and prosecuting people for not possession but for perjury.
The first comment is I think Willie Mays Aikens would have been Barry Bonds without needing drugs. That was the tragedy of his career. He would have been that good. He was that powerful home run hitter. Drugs have been a part of baseball since synthetic drugs began to be produced in a mass form. Greenies, they're called greenies. They're little green pills that baseball players started to pop during games to increase their attentiveness and energy levels in the 60s. Coffee. Baseball players drink coffee during the game. Caffeine gives them that boost. I think there's a poetic injustice here because in the 80s they did real drugs. Willie's guys will say that. We used to do the drugs that the people did. We didn't do this stuff to make our muscles bigger. And that's the absurdity of it. And I think that there's a generational disdain, not apart from the drug issue that Willie and his guys have, George Brett, for these guys who, it's so driven by success now. And back in Willie's days, in that '80 World Series team, it was still, the Kansas City team was a part of the community, and they were separated by salary differentials that were much smaller than they are now from the pay and Joe. So it's a different world. I don't think they're related. if anything. Willie did say that cocaine helped his performance. Who was the Villanova basketball player who died?
Who died?
He didn't die, but he admitted he was high during the
McLean.
Yeah, so cocaine and sports performance go hand in hand.
They won the NCAA title.
When they beat Georgetown. Yeah, he was high that night.
Yeah, in 1986 when Bias died, the Mets won the World Series, right? And Darryl Strawberry and Dwight Gooden were probably high out of their minds.
Every night.
I think Gooden admitted that, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean they were on cocaine. So drugs are a part of sports, and sports is part of drugs. But performance enhancing drugs, I don't know enough about that. I've never reported about that.
I'd like to add something on that. I don't know if you remember if you've heard of the skater Justin Gatlin, who won the Olympic gold medal in 2004 in 100 meters and 200 meters for the United States. A year later, he tested positive for a banned drug, a steroid. And I wrote a story about him a couple years ago and did a lot of research on this. And I'm basing my comments on that. I think the reason there's a lot of attention being brought to athletes and that they're being brought before Congress, I think it's sort of political play. I think it's taking advantage of their high profile for their own benefit. I think there's some of that. I think there's also a factor that compels this activity that you're letting the public down. There is still the idea about these athletes are pure when they compete. And the fans pay a lot of money. Fans create idols, and there has to be a leveling, a way to level the play. And the only way you can do that is to test for drugs. And Olympic sports are the most ardent testers of drugs. They're still cheating, they're still figuring out ways to get away with it, these athletes do. But I think it's the fact that these governing bodies try to level the playing field and keep the trust to an extent of those fans and people who are idolizing the athletes so they're still iconic, they're still athletes, and they're doing it fairly. I think Greg will agree with me that, and Darryl as well, baseball's been the worst sport for drug testing. And they've had this scandal, this steroid scandal for years. It hasn't affected the way fans react to baseball. They still follow the sport. I don't think it ever will. But I think there's still enough people concerned about what happens if this gets out of control that there'll be this complete mistrust of athletes. Entertainment form will be lost and sort of that kind of motivation for it.
Oh yeah, my name is Adrian Robinson. I was actually born here in Washington, D.C. I was born less than 2 miles away from where Lynn Bias bought his cocaine that night. I grew up a Maryland basketball fan.
I'm sorry, you said he bought it, so you heard something that we heard. Where was it obtained?
Where you acquired it.
Yeah, it was in Northeast Washington.
Right,
D.C.
right.
I actually just graduated from the University of Maryland this past May. I interned for the athletics department for 3 years. And in my junior year, I actually lived in the hall where he OD'd that night.
How about that?
Washington Hall. So I have somewhat
you have a connection.
Yeah, I have several connections with my bias. So the question I want to ask is, to what extent do you believe the financial implications of privatized prisons and privatized industrial prison workforces play on the sentence disparity between crack cocaine and other drug sentences?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. It reminds me that Willie asked me to say one thing in particular, which is that as great a tragedy, you all work on the front end of this issue. The back end is perhaps where the consequences are even more brutal, which is the failure to provide addiction treatment and reform in what's dubbed, ironically, the correctional system. The origins of the prison system in America, a lot of you probably know, they used to look like temples. They were built to look like churches. And the belief in the human capacity for redemption in a monastic environment, in a cell, was the very premise of not punishment, but that wasn't even the word then. But Willie, the real horror, the equal horror, is it's not just the sentencing, it's what happens after. You can't get better. You have to become, you know, there's the title of the 5th section of the book is El Disciplinante, which is the name for in Spain and Mexico for the religious figures who whip themselves during Holy Week. And that's what you have to be to recover from addiction in prison. And it works so rarely, so rarely. So it's a great book. Yeah. The system conspires against everything people here do.
To clarify, your question partially is how the privatizing of prisons is affecting?
Yes.
It's hard for me to believe that if you privatize a prison, their main objective is going to be the rehab of a prisoner.
Right.
They're going to be concerned about the bottom line. I mean, I don't see why they would be, if they're going to lose money and rehabilitate prisoners, why would they do it? I don't see that happening.
I think private prisons benefit from this country's prison culture. I mean, you don't privatize a prison and just build a prison. You build it based on marketing studies and projections. And if you're a marketer, you can look at what's happening in black communities and project how many people will need to be in prison, and you build based on that. I think that happens. And recently, the immigration culture and immigration detention, a lot of those inmates have gone to those prisons, and they profit greatly from that. And so if you want to make money in this country, building prisons is the way to do it.
Good question.
What do you get your degree in?
Communication studies.
Any other questions?
I'm just going to ask one more question. You all actually rattled off a lot of names of sports figures who have been involved with drugs over the years. Do you think that comes from the pressure to perform in the sports industry, that they turn to drugs, whether it's steroids, Morales example, or illegal, illicit drugs? Like I think Willie Mays Aikens, that would be my question specifically in reference to his case.
I think it's a bigger issue, and it ties to the 80s in a way I'm not smart enough to figure out, but there's a notion of self. You know, the idea of a solid human self, you have one, I have one, in this culture is a very hard thing to attain. And I think, particularly in athletes, when they're that successful that quickly and get that much fame, the self is all the more fractured because they're so young, you know? Yeah, it's just, yeah, I grew up hearing that, you know, the real problem is at home. It's not the school, but the notion of a whole self, a holistic self is really at the core of the drug issue and addiction, and it's just magnified. Willie's mother was a prostitute. She brought her clients back home. He shared a bed with his sister, and she would do her work in front of them. And he grew up that way. He needs some help, you know, and he found his help, he thought, in drugs. And the more famous he got, the more he needed to do that, because that was where, in that little community, where he felt safe and happy. It was fun. He didn't have much fun in the ball field or in the rest of his life. It was a fun place for him. And he needed to consume, you know. It started in the 80s. There's a book in there somewhere.
If I can add, I'll use two examples of athletes who succumb to the pressures of drugs and alcohol, and it's related to what Greg is saying about, I think their environment and their background growing up contribute a lot to their use. Anybody here remember David Thompson as a basketball player from NC State? Better than Jordan. Probably the best player to come out of the ACC. He had reports of a 42 or 44-inch vertical leap. He won an NCAA title. You know, there's got to be some video of this guy. He had the body of Jordan with the athletic ability of a bias. He was that good a player. Played in the NBA for 7 or 8 years, scored 73 points in one game. He at one point he signed the richest contract in the NBA, $4 million a year, like in the late 1970s. He was one of 10 children growing up in poverty in North Carolina. And I write about him in the book because I just want to make some comparisons of other athletes who felt pressure to drug use. Soon after playing in the NBA, he started abusing alcohol and drugs. And he admitted his personality was not, he didn't have the personality to be an outgoing person, to deal with everything off the court. He dealt with it by getting high, by getting drunk. His career ended in big part because Some of you may remember Studio 54 in New York City, the big disco in the 70s and I think into the 80s. He got in a fight. He was whacked out of his mind in a fight in the bar. After a game, somebody pushed him down the stairs and he wrecked his knee. And that contributed to it. He played 2 or 3 more years, but his career was altered because of a fight he got in because he was whacked out of his mind. He's one person who had trouble dealing with the periphery of being an elite athlete. The other is Chris Washburn, and he's directly related to the Len Bias story. Chris Washburn was a sophomore when Len was a senior. And Chris got to know Len that year in '86. They played against each other for the first time because Chris didn't play much his freshman year. When Len, after the players' careers are over, the ACC has something called a barnstorming tour where the players go play all-star games throughout North Carolina, and they make $1,000 or so, $500 at high school gyms. And it's all fun. It's for charity. Len was down there for that barnstorming tour in April of '86 and knocks on Chris Washburn's door at 3 in the morning. Chris Washburn never told anybody this before, and it was Len Bias with a friend. And he said, "Chris, we're getting high." And that's how Chris Washburn, it's the first time Chris Washburn used cocaine. So that he says. Other people have said he used it before, but he tells me that's the first time he used cocaine. Chris Washburn was drafted number 3, ended up going in the draft that year, one behind Len Bias. And I called him because I wanted to see if Len's death had affected his drug use. I knew he was an addict. And he said, well, you know, the first couple of months after Len died, no, you know, you're an addict, you don't care. But that's when he told me Len had just used cocaine. But he lasted 2 years in the NBA. This is a number 3 draft pick in 1986. Similar to Len, has this great career ahead of him. He becomes a cocaine addict, is out of the league in 2 years, and he ends up going to prison for cocaine. He dealt with his addiction for 10 or 12, 14, 15 years. He had the same reason as David Thompson. He could not deal with all the peripheral stuff that comes with being an elite athlete, a professional athlete. Some athletes are just not geared for it. I'm not aware of what Chris's background was that may have led to that, but he just couldn't handle it, and they find the refuge in drugs. It provides comfort level. They find a certain amount of comfort in that. So, and I'm sure it's happened many, many more times than that.
So that causes me to wonder what type of career a drug-addicted Len Bias would have had in the NBA. But he didn't have an impact on basketball fans, but he had a great impact on people who would have cheered for him, people who were behind bars. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank the authors, Dave and Greg Jordan, Dave Ungrady, and Ungrady.
It's all right. I'm really hurt much worse.
So I appreciate it. I appreciate everyone for coming. Thank you.
Yeah.
My daughter.